Hello, peace be upon you. Welcome to the Rational Religion Show, where we discuss religion, science, and society. My name is Omar Nasser.
And I am Tahir Nasser.
And we are going to be discussing what we can call a cultural crisis at the moment that is confronting many people in the West through the Black Lives Matter movement and the raising of consciousness about historical slavery and ongoing discrimination and systemic racism. We're going to be looking particularly into the religious and non-religious ideologies that feed into it. I am going to start with an entertaining but quite controversial tweet from Sean King. He says, "Yes, I think the statues of the white European they claim is Jesus should also come down. They are a form of white supremacy, always have been. In the Bible, when the family of Jesus wanted to hide and blend in, guess where they went? Egypt, not Denmark. Tear them down." And then he says, yes, all murals and stained glass windows of white Jesus and his European mother and their white friends, so interesting way of describing the disciples, should also come down. They are a gross form of white supremacy, created as tools of oppression, racist propaganda. They should all come down. Now, the first thing that strikes me is the repetition here. This second tweet seems somewhat redundant, to be honest. But he's saying that...
I would disagree with that.
Really?
He adds in murals and stained glass windows, which is a pretty massive attack on Christian architecture.
Fair enough. He's saying that they're a form of white supremacy. He's saying that Jesus is basically not a white European. And he's saying that all of this religious iconography should come down. So what do you think about that? Do you agree with that?
No, I mean, I think that's an act of vandalism, frankly. I think if anybody attacks a church trying to tear down a stained glass window, I would be at the forefront defending it as a Muslim because I'm a Muslim, because Islam teaches Muslims to defend to actually defend places of worship. So that's how I think about it. And I think an attack on stained glass windows and these kinds of things, yes, they may have a religious and a cultural significance that we do not necessarily buy into now, but they are one, works of art, and two, they are works of religious significance for Christian believers. So, if anybody came into my mosque to try and destroy the attributes of God on the wall, okay,
the lettering,
I'd feel the lettering, for example, the Arabic lettering of the attributes. I mean, I'd be as affronted as if somebody tried to destroy a church stained glass window in many respects, because I recognize that Christians have as much attachment to that as I would have to the attributes of God, because they believe that was God incarnate. Yeah. So, that's just a vandalistic attitude. However, there is a truth underpinning what Sean King says, which is that the white European Jesus has been used and has played a part in the development of systemic racism, but he's missing a broader point, which we can discuss. I mean, what do you think about it?
I think it's quite insensitive. I think it's, but he's probably really just trying to make this point. I think it's probably a hyperbolic way of making this point of the fact that Jesus was not a white European, and I think it's getting at a sense of a lot of, let's say, let's give a little bit of a caricature, but Christians in some parts of America who may not be extremely tolerant of, say, the Middle East or Middle Eastern peoples, and may be somewhat aggressive to them or have rather bellicose views towards them, while not realizing that actually Jesus was himself a Middle Eastern. You could call him an Arab or someone from that area quite loosely. And this idea that he's a white European, I think he's saying is, he wasn't that. He's not someone who's come from the same countries as you. He is someone who's comes from some of the countries which you class as your enemies. So why don't you have a little bit of historical knowledge about things and therefore broaden your view? So I think it's, for me at least, it's kind of getting to that annoyance of the realization of who Jesus was. But there's a broader point here, which is...
Can I just jump in there? I mean, if he had said all of that instead of writing what he did, I wouldn't have a problem with it, but that's not actually what he wrote.
Yeah.
I mean, he wrote basically that, Christian sites should be vandalized.
Yeah, no, and I don't agree with that, but I'm saying I feel like that's the sentiment that's kind of simmering under that.
I think that's a very generous reading of something that's pretty explicitly stated.
Okay, fair enough. But what do you agree with this idea that it's a form of white supremacy, or a manifestation of white supremacy? You know, what's your read on that?
I think it's inevitable you're going to get, look, when you divide God into different parts, the consequence of dividing God into the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is that even to differentiate between the three, you have to depict them in some form. Okay. You don't have to, but if you end up also depicting them, then it is done to kind of differentiate them. So the Father is usually seen as a kind of old man with a white beard figure. The Holy Spirit is a dove, and then the Son is Jesus.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that, actually, I think there's almost a philosophical point here, which is that, you know, the idea of God is usually that he's a transcendent, infinite being without form, immaterial. But as soon as you start splitting up God and say God can be three persons, then you have to say there's some kind of distinction between one thing and the other, because for there to be two persons or three persons, there need to be different characteristics. So then you start having some kind of division philosophically in the idea of God, which means God is one thing and he is not another thing. So he has some form, and that there can be different forms of God. And then you start to slide very quickly into ideas of, then God must be limited in some way. God must not be an unlimited being. He must be limited in certain ways, in certain respects.
As we said in our recent video, you know, God is this color, but not that color. He looks like this. He doesn't look like that. Yeah. Especially in the Christian view, and actually most religions which believe in some kind of multiplicity of God's persons, they are usually the root of it usually is that God manifests himself into human form in some way. So in the Christian theology, at least Pauline Christian theology, God manifested himself in Jesus and was God incarnate as the Son. So he has taken on a form. And as soon as you have God taking on a form, then you, as you said, you can be one color or not the other color. And that seems to be the way that actually current cultural ideologies or, you know, undertones in society can then find themselves and manifest themselves into religious iconography and religious depictions. Do you agree with that? And if so, how do you think that kind of happened in this case? Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, you know, there was obviously a political will to demonize people of darker skin. It's the reason why we've had a lot of demonization of Muslims in the last 20 years, is because there's a political will to invade Muslim countries. So, you know, a lot of that kind of hype and kind of attack of a particular group or a particular ethnicity or a particular background occurs, especially against the broader kind of picture of colonialism or invasion of a people. And part of that, and part of the buttressing of that, is the use of religion for that, obviously. And especially in the Middle Ages, especially when colonialism started to occur, especially towards the beginning of the 17th century, you know, people were religious. They were religious like they are not today. And so it's only natural that God and the concept of God would be used to justify those kinds of political actions.
Okay. So you're saying that we had an era of colonization, and God, who was, you know, the highest being in society, the highest thing to which you look, and God's religion was used to, let's say, justify certain philosophies or certain actions of states. And in what way do you feel that white supremacy kind of came into that in Christianity?
Well, for example, you know, you have the concept of the white Jesus, and you see this in many depictions of Jesus. That's one way. There are other ways, however, in terms of the demonization of Black people as spiritually inferior, as morally inferior. So it happens both ways. And also there's an effect of the white Jesus concept on Black people themselves. I mean, if you enslave large populations of West Africans, you know, take them and ship them over to America, and then you forcibly convert them from their previous religions, which are either often paganized religions or Islam, okay? And then you stick them in churches, you rename them. Yeah. Okay, so they're no longer their original African names. They're now Butler or Bill or whatever. Yeah. And now you put a picture of a white Jesus on the wall who looks like their slave master. Yeah. What are you telling them?
Yeah.
You're telling them that they are inferior, that God, when he manifested himself, even he chose to look like your slave masters. Even he didn't want to look like you.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's how far removed you are in the picture of divine authority and divine love.
So then you basically entrench racist ideologies through a religious philosophy. And I think that's what happened. And there's, as we talk about in our recent video on Malcolm X and some issues around there, that's also seems to have happened in Hindu philosophy as well, when you have a great multiplicity of gods, and some are definitely dark skinned, but many and most the majority seem to be very fair skinned. And you have great epics about a dark-skinned god overcoming a light-skinned god overcoming dark-skinned other entities. And in India, there's a huge problem with racism about people trying to have fair skin rather than dark skin. And actually, throughout the world, you have people trying to make their skin fairer and all kinds of bleaching products. So I think actually the key thing is that, at least from my reading, I don't know if you'd agree with this, it's not that the idea of Trinity or even polytheism in itself is inherently leads to racism just like that as a direct causal link. It's more that when you have different forms of God coming, and you have religious iconography, and you have the ability to depict, what you can do, what you open the door to, is entrenching damaging philosophies into your religion. Is that your feeling as well?
There's a really great there's a really great verse of the Quran on this in chapter 29, verse 26. And it says this, and he said, "Verily you have taken for yourselves idols beside Allah, the one God, out of love for each other in the present life." In other words, the development of idolatry occurs as a phenomenon whereby God is used to solidify material and worldly relationships. And so in a way, this is why idolatry, people often wonder, well, why does God get so irate in Judaism and Islam? Christianity's, fallen away from its Judaic origins. But so in Judaism and Islam, which have at least maintained the concept of the fundamental concept of oneness of God, why does God get so irate about being one? I mean, why is he so jealous about this? Why?
Yeah.
And the answer is very simple, and the Quran gives it many times. This is one example of a verse which explains it, which is that when you take other gods beside God, or you take the concept of God and split it up, the natural consequence of that is you get divinity resting, or the concept of the authority of divinity resting in various different beings. Okay, and the consequence of that is that man seeks to actually use God and the concept of God to justify his own evil. And so the concept of God loses all power as a reformatory concept, because instead of God regulating human behavior, God is now used to justify human behavior.
Right.
Okay? Instead of, because with the concept of the one God, for example, you can never really argue that God hates this other people. Well, then why did he create them?
Yeah.
If there's one God, then it means all humanity is from that one God, in which case we all have basic equality before God.
Yeah.
But when you begin to divide God up, and then you pit your God against that God, okay, then the natural consequence of that will be that you use then God to justify your own evil. And so the concept of God becomes impotent as a spiritual concept of reformation. And that's why God has such a big deal with people, other than the fact that it's a lie, and that you're just worshipping stones, and that you're just worshipping a human being who lived and has no power to actually do you any good.
Yeah.
One of the reasons, I believe, is actually because it nullifies the very purpose and the benefit of God as well for human beings.